I wasn't originally gonna include the foreword or introduction in this audiobook type thing, given that it's meant to serve as a recap or overview of The Wind of History parts 1 through 10, but I decided to anyway. I think they're pretty good. So we'll start on the recap stuff in the next video. A little background info on the book and author. Another View of Stalin was written by activist, author, and historian Ludo Martens, who founded the Workers' Party of Belgium. Interestingly, he was apparently the final foreigner to meet with Kim Il-sung before the latter's death in 1994. This book was published the same year. It was one of multiple works Martens put out. Unfortunately, he passed away on June 5, 2011, after a lengthy illness. He was 65 years old. It's also unfortunate that leaders in the party he founded have reportedly distanced themselves from his view of Stalin. They denounced the latter as a dictator. Funnily enough, even the CIA acknowledged that Stalin wasn't a dictator in documents. But anyway, let's get into the text. Forward. That a famous Soviet dissident, now living in reunited Germany, a man who in his youth was so fanatically anti-Stalin that he planned a terrorist attack against him, who filled entire books with vehement denunciation of Stalin's political line in every possible way, that such a man would, in his old age, pay homage to Stalin, is remarkable. Many who consider themselves communists have not shown such courage. It is very difficult to raise one's feeble voice against the torrents of anti-Stalin propaganda. Unfortunately, many communists do not feel at ease on this battlefield. Everything that sworn enemies of communism had claimed for 35 years was supposedly confirmed by Khrushchev in 1956. Since then, angry, unanimous condemnations of Stalin have come from the Nazis and the Trotskyists, from Kissinger and Brzezinski, from Khrushchev and Gorbachev, and many others, each adding to the proof. To defend the historic role of Stalin in the Bolshevik Party becomes unthinkable, even monstrous. And most people who firmly oppose the murderous anarchy of world capitalism have become intimidated. Today, for a man such as Zinoviev, and note that this Zinoviev is not to be confused with Grigory Zinoviev, who was an old Bolshevik, but often not a great Leninist, to say the least. And that's putting it pretty generously. We'll hear a little more about him later on. Continuing. For a man such as Zinoviev, seeing the destructive folly that has taken hold of the ex-Soviet Union, with its trail of famine, unemployment, criminality, misery, corruption, and inter-ethnic wars, has led to the reassessment of prejudices firmly held since adolescence. It is clear that, throughout the world, those who wish to defend the ideals of socialism and communism must at least do the same. All communist and revolutionary organizations across the globe must re-examine the opinions and judgments that they have formed since 1956 about Comrade Stalin's work. No one can deny the evidence. When Gorbachev succeeded in eradicating all of Stalin's achievements, crowning 35 years of virulent denunciations of Stalinism, Lenin himself became persona non grata in the Soviet Union. With the burial of Stalinism, Leninism disappeared as well. Rediscovering the revolutionary truth about this pioneer period is a collective task that must be borne by all communists around the world. This revolutionary truth will arise by questioning sources, testimony, and analyses. Clearly, the aid that might be offered by Soviet Marxist-Leninists, sometimes the only ones with direct access to sources and to witnesses, will be vital. But today they work under very difficult conditions. Our analyses and reflections on this subject are published in this work, Another View of Stalin. The view of Stalin that is imposed on us daily is that of the class that wants to maintain the existing system of exploitation and oppression. Adopting another view of Stalin means looking at the historic Stalin through the eyes of the oppressed class, through the eyes of the exploited and oppressed. This book is not designed to be a biography of Stalin. It is intended to directly confront the standard attacks made against Stalin. Lenin's will, forced collectivization, overbearing bureaucracy, extermination of the old Bolshevik Guard, the Great Purge, forced industrialization, collusion between Stalin and Hitler, his incompetency during World War II, etc. We have endeavored to deconstruct many well-known truths about Stalin, those that are summarized, over and over, in a few lines in newspapers, history books, and interviews, and which have more or less become part of our unconscious. "But how is it possible," asked a friend, "to defend a man like Stalin?" There was astonishment and indignation in this question, which reminded me of what an old communist worker once told me. He spoke to me of the year 1956, when Khrushchev read his famous secret report. Powerful debates took place within the Communist Party. During one of these confrontations, an elderly communist woman from a Jewish communist family who lost 2 children during the war and whose family in Poland was exterminated, cried out, "How can we not support Stalin, who built socialism, who defeated fascism, who incarnated all our hopes?" In the fiery ideological storm that was sweeping the world, where others had capitulated, this woman remained true to the revolution, and for this reason, she had another view of Stalin. A new generation of communists will share her view. Introduction: The Importance of Stalin. On August 20th, 1991, Yanayev's ridiculous coup d'état was the last step in eliminating the remaining vestiges of communism in the Soviet Union. Statues of Lenin were torn down and his ideas were attacked. This event provoked numerous debates in communist and revolutionary movements. Some said it was completely unexpected. In April 1991, we published a book, USSR, The Velvet Counter-Revolution, which essentially covers the political and ideological evolution of the USSR and of Eastern Europe since 1956. Now that Yeltsin has made his professional coup d'état and that he has vehemently proclaimed capitalist restoration, our analysis still stands. In fact, the last confused confrontations between Yanayev, Gorbachev, and Yeltsin were mere convulsions, expressing decisions made during the 28th Congress in July 1990. We wrote at the time that this Congress clearly affirms a rupture with socialism and a return to capitalism. A Marxist analysis of the events that occurred in the Soviet Union had already led, in 1989, to the following conclusion. Quote, Gorbachev is implementing a slow and progressive, but systematic, evolution to capitalist restoration. Gorbachev, his back to the wall, is seeking increasing political and economic support from the imperialist world. In return, he allows the West to do as it pleases in the Soviet Union. Unquote. A year later, at the end of 1990, we concluded our analysis as follows. Quote, since 1985, Gorbachev has not firmly and consistently defended any political position. In waves, the right has attacked. Each new wave has dragged Gorbachev further to the right. Confronted by further attacks by nationalists and fascists, supported by Yeltsin, it is not impossible that Gorbachev will again retreat, which will undoubtedly provoke the disintegration of the CPSU and the Soviet Union. The balkanization of Africa and of the Arab world has ensured ideal conditions for imperialist domination. The more far-seeing in the West are now dreaming beyond capitalist restoration in the USSR. They are dreaming of its political and economic subjugation. It is no accident that we recall these Marxist-Leninist conclusions from 1989 and 1990. The dynamiting of statues of Lenin was accompanied by an explosion of propaganda claiming victory over Marxism-Leninism. However, only the Marxist analysis was correct, was capable of clarifying the real social forces working under the demagogic slogans of freedom and democracy and glasnost and perestroika. In 1956, during the bloody counter-revolution in Hungary, statues of Stalin were destroyed. 35 years later, statues of Lenin have been reduced to dust. The dismantling of statues of Stalin and Lenin marks the two basic breaks with Marxism. In 1956, Khrushchev attacked Stalin's achievements so that he could change the fundamental line of the Communist Party. The progressive disintegration of the political and economic system that followed led to the final break with socialism in 1990 by Gorbachev. Of course, the media hark on every day about the clear failure of communism around the world. But we must reiterate that, if there was a failure in the Soviet Union, it was a failure of revisionism, introduced by Khrushchev 35 years ago. This revisionism led to complete political failure, to capitulation to imperialism and to economic catastrophe. The current eruption of savage capitalism and of fascism in the USSR shows clearly what happens when the revolutionary principles of Marxism-Leninism are rejected. For 35 years, the revisionists worked to destroy Stalin. Once Stalin was demolished, Lenin was liquidated with a flick of the wrist. Khrushchev fought mercilessly against Stalin, Gorbachev carried on by leading, during his 5 years of glasnost, a crusade against Stalinism. Notice that the dismantling of Lenin's statues was not preceded by a political campaign against his work. The campaign against Stalin was sufficient. Once Stalin's ideas were attacked, vilified, and destroyed, it became clear that Lenin's ideas had suffered the same fate. Khrushchev started his destructive work by criticizing Stalin's errors in order to reassert Leninism in its original form and to improve the communist system. Gorbachev made the same demagogic promises to confuse the forces of the left. Today, things have been made crystal clear. Under the pretext of returning to Lenin, the Tsar returns. Under the pretext of improving communism, savage capitalism has erupted. Most people on the left have read a few books about the activities of the CIA and of Western secret services. They have learned that psychological and political warfare is a fundamental and extremely important part of modern total warfare. Slanders, brainwashing, provocation, manipulation of differences, exacerbation of contradictions, slandering of adversaries, and perpetration of crimes that are then blamed on the adversary are all normal tactics used by Western secret services in modern warfare. But the wars that imperialism has waged with the greatest energy and with the most colossal resources are the anti-communist wars. Military wars, clandestine wars, political wars, and psychological wars. Isn't it obvious that the anti-Stalin campaign was at the heart of all ideological battles against socialism and communism? The official spokesman for the U.S. war machine, Kissinger and Brzezinski, praised the works of Solzhenitsyn and Conquest, who were, by coincidence, two authors favored by social democrats, Trotskyists, and anarchists. Instead of discovering the truth about Stalin among these specialists of anti-communism, wouldn't it have been better to look for the strings of psychological warfare by the CIA? It is truly not an accident that we can find today, in almost all stylish bourgeois and petty bourgeois publications, the same slanders and lies about Stalin that were found in the Nazi press during the Second World War. This is a sign that the class struggle is becoming fierce throughout the world, and that the world bourgeoisie is mobilizing all its forces to defend its democracy. During seminars about the Stalin period, we have often read a long anti-Stalin text and asked the audience what they thought of it. Almost invariably, they replied that the text, although virulently anti-communist, clearly showed the enthusiasm of the young and poor for Bolshevism, as well as the technical achievements of the USSR. By and large, the text is nuanced. We then told the audience that this was a Nazi text, published in Signal 24, 1943, at the height of the war. The anti-Stalin campaigns conducted by the Western democracies in 1989 to 1991 were often more violent and more slanderous than those conducted by the Nazis in the 1930s. Today, the great communist achievements of the 1930s are no longer with us to counteract the slanders, and there are no longer any significant forces to defend the Soviet experience under Stalin. When the bourgeoisie announces the definitive failure of communism, it uses the pathetic failure of revisionism to reaffirm its hatred of the great work achieved in the past by Lenin and Stalin. Nevertheless, it is thinking much more about the future than about the past. The bourgeoisie wants people to think that Marxism-Leninism is buried once and for all, because it is quite aware of the accuracy and the vitality of communist analysis. The bourgeoisie has a whole gamut of cadres capable of making scientific evaluations of the world's evolution, and so it sees major crises and upheavals on a planetary scale and wars of all kinds. Since capitalism has been restored in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, each contradiction of the world imperialist system has been exacerbated. When the working masses throughout the world face the specters of unemployment, misery, exploitation, and war, only Marxism-Leninism can show them the way out. Only Marxism-Leninism can provide arms to the working masses of the capitalist world and to the oppressed peoples of the Third World. Given these great future struggles, all this rubbish about the end of communism is intended to disarm the oppressed masses of the entire world. Defending Stalin's work, essentially defending Marxism-Leninism, is an important, urgent task in preparing ourselves for class struggle under the New World Order. Stalin is of vital importance in the former socialist countries. Since capitalist restoration in the USSR, Stalin's work has become important in understanding the mechanisms of recent class struggles under socialism. There is a link between the capitalist restoration and the virulent campaign against Stalin that preceded it. The explosion of hatred against a man who died in 1953 might seem strange, if not incomprehensible. During the 20 years that preceded Gorbachev's rise to power, Brezhnev incarnated bureaucracy, stagnation, corruption, and militarism. But neither in the Soviet Union nor in the free world did we ever witness a violent, raging attack against Brezhnev similar to the ones against Stalin. It is obvious that over the last few years, in the USSR as well as in the rest of the world, all the fanatics of capitalism and of imperialism, to finish off what remained of socialism in the USSR, focused on Stalin as the target. The disastrous turn taken by Khrushchev shows in fact the pertinence of most of Stalin's ideas. Stalin stressed that class struggle continues under socialism, that the old feudal and bourgeois forces never stopped their struggle for restoration, and that the opportunists in the party, the Trotskyists, the Bukharinists, and the bourgeois nationalists, helped the anti-socialist classes regroup their forces. Khrushchev declared that these were aberrations and that they led to arbitrary measures. But in 1993, the apparition of Tsar Boris stands out as a monument to the correctness of Stalin's judgment. Adversaries of the dictatorship of the proletariat never stopped in insisting that Stalin represented not the dictatorship of the workers, but his own autocratic dictatorship. The word gulag means Stalinist dictatorship. But those who were in the gulag during Stalin's era are now part of the bourgeoisie in power. To demolish Stalin was to give socialist democracy a new birth. But once Stalin was buried, Hitler came out of his tomb. And in Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Slovakia, etc., all the fascist heroes are resurrected, ilk such as Vlasov, Bandera, Antonescu, Tiso, and other Nazi collaborators. The destruction of the Berlin Wall heralded the rise of neo-Nazism in Germany. Today, when faced with the unleashing of capitalism and fascism in Eastern Europe, it is easier to understand that Stalin did in fact defend workers' power. Stalin is at the center of political debates in socialist countries. The media never stopped reminding us that there are still, unfortunately, a few Stalinist outposts on the planet. Fidel Castro holds his little island like a Stalinist dinosaur. Kim Il-sung surpassed Stalin in the area of the cult of the personality. The Chinese butchers of Tiananmen Square are worthy successors of Stalin. A few dogmatic Vietnamese still have pictures of Ho Chi Minh and of Stalin. In short, the 4 countries that still uphold a socialist line are excommunicated from the civilized world in the name of Stalin. This incessant clamor is designed to bring out and reinforce anti-Stalinist, bourgeois and petty bourgeois currents in these countries. Stalin's work is of crucial importance in the Third World. At the same time, in the Third World, all the forces that oppose, in one way or another, imperialist barbarity are hunted down and attacked in the name of the struggle against Stalinism. So, according to the French newspaper Le Monde, the Communist Party of the Philippines has just been seized by the Stalinist demon of the purges. According to a tract from the Mason Group, the Stalinists of the Tigray People's Liberation Front have just seized power in Addis Ababa. In Peru as well, we hear of Mao's Stalinist ideas, that stereotyped formal language of another era. We can even read that the Syrian Ba'ath Party leads a, quote, closed society, almost Stalinist. Right in the middle of the Gulf War, a newspaper reported to us that a Soviet pamphlet compared photographs of Stalin and Saddam Hussein and concluded that Saddam was an illegitimate son of the great Georgian, and the butchers that chased Father Aristide from Haiti seriously claimed that he had installed, quote, a totalitarian dictatorship. Stalin's work is important for all peoples engaged in the revolutionary struggle for freedom from the barbaric domination of imperialism. Stalin represents, just like Lenin, steadfastness in the fiercest and most merciless of class struggles. Stalin showed that, in the most difficult situations, only a firm and inflexible attitude towards the enemy can resolve the fundamental problems of the working masses. Conciliatory, opportunistic, and capitulationist attitudes will inevitably lead to catastrophe and to bloody revenge by the reactionary forces. commenting, kinda like we've seen in China and other places. Continuing. Today, the working masses of the Third World find themselves in a very difficult situation, with no hope in sight, resembling conditions in the Soviet Union in 1920 to 1933. Not completely sure what he means by that, but yeah. In Mozambique, the most reactionary forces in the country were used by the CIA and the South African boss to massacre 900,000 Mozambicans. The Hindu fundamentalists, long protected by the Congress Party and upheld by the Indian bourgeoisie, are leading India into bloody terror. In Colombia, the collusion between the reactionary army and police, the CIA, and the drug traffickers is providing a bloodbath among the masses. In Iraq, where a criminal aggression killed more than 200,000, the embargo imposed by our great defenders of human rights continues to slowly kill tens of thousands of children. In each of these extreme situations, Stalin's example shows us how to mobilize the masses for a relentless and victorious struggle against enemies ready to use any means. But a great number of revolutionary parties of the Third World, engaged in merciless battles against barbaric imperialism, progressively deviated towards opportunism and capitulation, and this disintegration process almost always started with the ideological attacks against Stalin. The evolution of parties such as the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, FMLN, in El Salvador is a prime example. From about 1985, a right opportunist tendency developed within the Communist Party of the Philippines. It wanted to end the popular war and to start a process of national reconciliation. Following Gorbachev, the tendency virulently attacked Stalin. This same opportunism also had a left form. Wanting to come to power quickly, others proposed a militarist line and an urban political insurrection. In order to eliminate police infiltration, leaders of this tendency organized a purge within the party in Mindanao. They executed several hundred persons, violating all of the party's rules. But when the Central Committee decided to conduct an ideological and political rectification campaign, these opportunists all united against the Stalinist purge. Jose Maria wrote, quote, "Those who oppose the rectification movement most bitterly are those who have been most responsible for the militarist viewpoint, the gross reduction of the mass base, witch hunts of monstrous proportions, violative of all sense of democracy and decency, and degeneration into gangsterism. These renegades have in fact, and in effect, joined up with the intelligence and cyber agents of the U.S. Ramos regime in an attempt to stop the CPP from strengthening itself ideologically, politically, and organizationally." And that's from Jose Marie Sisson, Statement of Denial and Condemnation. The Journal of Democratic Palestine of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, also opened up a debate on Stalin. Quote, "Negative aspects of the Stalin era which have been highlighted include forced collectivization, repression of free expression and democracy in the party and in the society, ultra-centralization of decision-making in the party, the Soviet state, and the international communist movement." Unquote. All these so-called criticisms of Stalin are nothing more than a verbatim rehash of old social democratic anti-communist criticisms. To choose this road and to follow it to its end means, ultimately, the end of the PFLP as a revolutionary organization. The experience of all those who have taken this road leaves no room for doubt. The recent evolution of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, is instructive about this subject. In his interview of Fidel Castro, Thomas Borge vigorously attacked Stalinism. It is under this camouflage that the FSLN transformed itself into a bourgeois social democratic entity. Stalin's work takes on new meaning given the situation created since capitalist restoration in Central and Eastern Europe. Stalin's revolutionary work also takes on importance in the new European situation, with capitalist restoration in the East. The civil war in Yugoslavia shows the carnage that could spread to the whole of the European continent if the rising contradictions between imperialist powers provoked a new world war. Such a possibility can no longer be excluded. Today's map of the world strikingly resembles the situation between 1900 and 1914, when the imperialist powers vied for world economic dominance. Today, the relations between the six imperialist centers, the US, Great Britain, Japan, Germany, Russia, and France are becoming very unstable. We have entered a period when alliances are done and undone, and in which battles in the economic and commercial sphere are undertaken with increasing energy. The formation of new imperialist blocs that will violently confront each other becomes a real possibility. A war between big imperialist powers would make all of Europe into a giant Yugoslavia. Given such a possibility, Stalin's work deserves to be restudied. In communist parties around the world, the ideological struggle around the Stalin question presents many common characteristics. In all capitalist countries, the economic, political, and ideological pressure exerted by the bourgeoisie on communists is incredibly strong. It is a permanent source of degeneration, of treason, of slow descent into the other camp. But every treacherous act requires ideological justification in the eyes of the one who is committing it. In general, a revolutionary who engages on the downward slope of opportunism discovers the truth about Stalinism. He or she takes, as is, the bourgeois and anti-communist version of the history of the revolutionary movement under Stalin. In fact, the renegades make no discovery, they simply copy the bourgeoisie's lies. Why have so many renegades discovered the truth about Stalin? To improve the communist movement, of course. But none among them has discovered the truth about Churchill, a discovery which would be much more important for improving the anti-imperialist struggle. Having a record of half a century of crimes in the service of the British Empire, Boer War in South Africa, terror in India, inter-imperialist First World War followed by military intervention against the new Soviet Republic, war against Iraq, terror in Kenya, declaration of the Cold War, aggression against anti-fascist Greece, etc. Churchill is probably the only bourgeois politician of this century to have equaled Hitler. I think that might be a bit of an exaggeration. Churchill was definitely terrible, but probably not quite at that level. Or maybe he was? I'm not completely sure. Continuing. Every political and historical work is marked by the class position of its author. From the 20s to 1953, the majority of Western publications about the Soviet Union served the bourgeoisie's and the petty bourgeoisie's attacks against Soviet socialism. Writings by Communist Party members and of left intellectuals trying to defend the Soviet experience constituted a weak countercurrent in defending the truth about the Soviet experience. But from 1953 to 56, Khrushchev and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would take up, bit by bit, all the bourgeois historiography about the Stalin period. Since then, revolutionaries in the Western world have been subject to a terrible and unending ideological onslaught about the crucial periods in the rise of the communist movement, particularly the Stalin era. If Lenin led the October Revolution and drew the main lines for building socialism, it was Stalin who actually put those lines into action for 30 years. The bourgeoisie's hatred is of course concentrated on the titanic task achieved under Stalin. A communist who does not adopt a firm class position with respect to the misleading, one-sided, incomplete or false information that the bourgeoisie spreads around will be lost forever. For no other subject in recent history does the bourgeoisie denigrate its adversaries so fiercely. Every communist must adopt an attitude of systematic mistrust towards all information furnished by the bourgeoisie and the Khrushchevites about the Stalin period, and he or she must do everything possible to discover the rare alternative sources of information that defend Stalin's revolutionary endeavor. But opportunists in different parties dare not directly confront the anti-Stalin ideological offensive directly, despite its clear anti-communist goal. The opportunists bend backwards under pressure, saying yes to a criticism of Stalin, but pretending to criticize Stalin from the left. Today, we can sum up 70 years of criticisms from the left, formulated by the revolutionary experience of the Bolshevik Party under Stalin. There are hundreds of works available, written by social democrats and Trotskyists, by Bukharinists and independent left intellectuals. Their points of view have been taken up and developed by Khrushchevites and Titoists. We can better understand today the real class meaning of these works. Did any of these criticisms lead to revolutionary practices more important than the work under Stalin? Theories are, of course, judged by the social practice they engender. The revolutionary practice of the world communist movement under Stalin shook the whole world and gave a new direction to the history of humanity. During the years 1985 to 1990, in particular, we have been able to see that all the so-called left critics of Stalin have jumped onto the anti-communist bandwagon, just countless cheerleaders, social democrats, Trotskyists, anarchists, Bukharinists, Titoists, ecologists, all found themselves in the movement for liberty, democracy, and human rights, which liquidated what remained of socialism in Eastern Europe and in the USSR. All these left criticisms of Stalin had as final consequence the restoration of savage capitalism, the reinstatement of a merciless dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and the destruction of all social gains, cultural and political rights for the working masses, and, in many cases, to the emergence of fascism and of reactionary civil wars. When Khrushchev initiated the anti-Stalin campaigns in 1956, those communists who resisted revisionism and defended Stalin were affected in a peculiar manner. In 1956, the Chinese Communist Party had the revolutionary courage to defend Stalin's work. Its document, once more on the experience of the dictatorship of the proletariat, considerably helped Marxist-Leninists all over the world. Based on their own experience, the Chinese Communists criticized certain aspects of Stalin's work. This is perfectly normal and necessary in a discussion among communists. However, with the benefit of time, it seems that their criticisms were formulated too generally. This negatively influenced many communists who lent credibility to all sorts of opportunistic criticism. For example, the Chinese comrades claimed that Stalin did not always clearly distinguish the two kinds of contradiction, those among the people, which can be overcome through education and struggle, and those between the people and the enemy, which require appropriate means of struggle. From this general criticism, some concluded that Stalin did not properly treat the contradictions with Bukharin, and ended up embracing Bukharin's social democratic political line. The Chinese communists also stated that Stalin interfered in the affairs of other parties and denied them their independence. From this general criticism, some concluded that Stalin was wrong in condemning Tito's policies, ultimately accepting Titoism as a specifically Yugoslav form of Marxism-Leninism. The recent events in Yugoslavia allow one to better understand how Tito, since his break with the Bolshevik Party, followed a bourgeois nationalist line and ultimately fell into the U.S. fold. The ideological reticence and errors enumerated above about the Stalin question occurred in almost all Marxist-Leninist parties. A general conclusion can be drawn. In our judgment, of all the episodes during the period 1923 to 1953, we must struggle to understand completely the political line held by the Bolshevik Party and by Stalin. We cannot accept any criticism of Stalin's work without verifying all primary data pertaining to the question under debate and without considering all versions of facts and events, in particular, the version given by the Bolshevik leadership. That's the end of the introduction. In the next one, we'll start on The Young Stalin Forges His Arms.